Good morning. I believe we're just waiting for Stephanie to get us started, and then we'll be getting right along with the presentation.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Jennifer, good morning.
Good
Good
morning.
morning. I'm Stephanie Snyder with the State Chamber of Oklahoma. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning as we learn more about how our businesses can get back to work. I would like to thank Alcott HR for hosting this webinar today and providing their expertise on HR-related topics and questions. Earlier this year, our organization entered into a partnership with Alcott HR, a member of the Cameron Group of Companies headquartered in Oklahoma. Alcott HR provides a solution to streamline HR-related tasks and allow more time to focus on your business and employees. The State Chamber of Oklahoma has been very busy these past few weeks working with our members to ensure that they are receiving information and resources to help them navigate through the COVID-19 pandemic. Our president and CEO, Chad Warmington, was asked to chair the governor's Bounce Back Advisory Group, which has been advising the governor and his team on reopening and recovery efforts for our economy. In light of Oklahoma's reopening efforts underway, we've received several questions about how businesses can safely reopen, what they should do about rehiring workers who were temporarily let go, and what should be done to protect their employees in the work environment upon their return. While the CDC guidelines can help all of us on the public health front, many of you might have unique HR-related questions and issues that can't be addressed in a one-size-fits-all situation. Today's webinar is intended to help you navigate these uncertain times as your business reopens, and our partners at Alcott have gathered all of the latest information to provide you a timely and relevant update, as well as sharing best practices on reopening and rehiring. Alcott's experts Kelly Jones, Business Development Specialist, Jennifer Aiello, Human Resources Specialist, and Jose Santiago, General Counsel and HR Compliance, are eager to share information with you that we hope you find helpful in the weeks and months ahead. As a reminder, which I'm sure Jose will cover too, this is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as medical or legal advice. So welcome.
Thank you. Or tax advice. There are a couple of slides regarding the PPP loans as well. All right, so I guess I'll get us started. Stephanie, thank you for that introduction. As Stephanie mentioned, I'm General Counsel as well as the Compliance Manager here at Alcott HR. My astute colleague, Jennifer Aiello, will be joining me as well and assist in presenting this webinar to you. Obviously, there's a lot going on right now and throughout the United States. Many states are struggling with one, can we reopen, should we reopen, and also when we actually do reopen, what is that going to look like? And for employers, what does that mean? As employers, we have a unique responsibility to our staff, to our customers, to our community, and we're going to try to go over some of the things that we need to take into account as business owners and employers as we reopen. And so in today's webinar, we're going to discuss a few topics. Specifically, we'll briefly go over some of the PPP loan forgiveness parameters to keep in mind as you're reopening. We're going to briefly address the different phases of reopening specific to the state of Oklahoma. We're going to discuss the actual recalling of employees and what does that mean for you as employers. We're going to discuss the potential challenge of employees not wanting to return and what do we do if they don't want to return. We're going to briefly discuss, how are we going to adapt to the new normal. Some of these, we've all been kind of thrown into this social experiment that is COVID-19 and our response to COVID-19 and what, if anything, can we expect moving forward as we look into the future. Right. And in that first, there we go. All right, so again, as Stephanie mentioned, the information in this presentation, this webinar, is intended to provide general best practices and employment guidance. Alcott HR, we don't render legal advice, and the content of this presentation doesn't constitute the provision of legal counsel or or tax advice. And information contained is current as of today. As you guys have seen, things change on a day-to-day basis. And so what we're trying to do is get you the most recent guidance as we know it as of today. So with regard to the PPP loan, those of you that have taken advantage of the program and have been provided funding pursuant to this SBA backed PPP loan, keep in mind that some of the certifications that you've made when accepting funds pursuant to this program, you've certified that at least 75% is going to be spent on payroll. Also, that you're going to do your best to try to bring your full-time equivalents up to whatever they were during the measurement period that you used. And you're going to try to bring back your full-time equivalents by June 30th of 2020. If you don't bring back your full-time equivalents up to the number that existed during your measurement period, you risk losing some forgiveness of your loan. So for example, if you had 100 full-time equivalent employees and you only get it to 90 by June 30th, 2020, that 10% difference, you may lose 10% of your loan's forgiveness. So you'd have to pay back potentially 10% of that loan. Also, that none of your employees that you return will experience more than a 25% wage reduction. You will not reduce their wages by more than 25%. Again, if you do reduce it by more than 25%, that may result in you losing some forgiveness component to your loan. So for example, if you have an employee's wages are reduced by 30%, then that 5% extra, that overage in reduction, you can lose another 5% forgiveness on the loan. And so that is something that we want to make sure we try to avoid. And to the extent possible, we want to make sure that you hit all the targets to maintain forgiveness, the forgiveness component of your PPP loan. All right, and now to discuss the different phases of reopening and kind of flow right into bringing employees back, I'm going to turn over to my colleague Janayella.
Good morning, everyone. So Oklahoma is starting to reopen, which is amazing. I did read a report yesterday that showed that Oklahoma was 8th in the United States in terms of the least amount of COVID cases per capita. So way to go, Oklahoma. Kudos to you. And what that means for y'all is that you're currently in the first phase of the reopening plan for Oklahoma. It started on April 24th with the opening of personal care businesses and outdoor recreation. And then on May 1st, it was stepped up a notch to open administrative offices, dining, entertainment, movie theaters, sporting venues, gyms, tattoo parlors, and places of worship. So for the most part, I would assume everyone on this call has the ability to be open at this time. And when it comes to group events, they're currently limited to 10 people at the event. Phase 2, which is projected to start May 15th, and I did read a comment from the governor yesterday stating that we are on track to enter phase 2 on May 15th, so that's great news. On May 15th, the operation of organized sports activities. So currently the venues are open, but you can only have 10 people in the venue. So not a lot can happen at these venues right now, but as of May 15th, you'll be able to have normal organized sports activities going on as long as the group is limited to 50 people. Bars will also be opening on the 15th, and nurseries and places of worship, as well as the allowance of funerals and weddings being able to be held at this time. Now, there is some specific employer guidance that has been released for phase 1 and 2. So the current stage we're in through June 1st, which is the projection for now, but we'll see, as you know. So currently, the employer guidance includes allowing your employees to return to work in phases. So although these businesses are open, you shouldn't be recalling everyone all at once without a plan in order to continue social distancing practices. You also want to take a look at your policies and make sure you have policies in place for temperature checks should you need to do that, sanitation schedules, flexible sick leave, what you would do if there was a workplace exposure incident, as well as your travel. Currently, the guidance states that you should limit workplace travel to only essential travel at this time. So keep that in mind. Now, when your employees are in your workplace, you want to make sure that you're monitoring for symptoms. The employees should, of course, be monitoring themselves, and you as the employer should also be keeping your eyes peeled for anyone who's showing some of those COVID symptoms. Now, this is difficult to do right now because we are entering our all the blooms are blossoming and people are having allergies, right? So make sure that when you see someone who might be symptomatic, you're going up to them and just saying, hey, how are you feeling? Rather than assuming that they have COVID-19. And if an employee comes to you and lets you know that they're not feeling well, you should absolutely permit them to go home at that time. You should not be allowing any symptomatic employees to work. Now, part of what you need to be looking at, as we already talked about, developing your policies, you need to make sure that you're implementing appropriate safety policies around social distancing as well as PPE, the protective equipment that employees can be wearing at this time. Some of the things that you can do in terms of safety policies for social distancing, you can recall your employees in phases. So maybe right now you're at 25% of your staff, and then next week you move to 50%, and later on in the month you move to 75% until we get to that phase 3 and you're fully staffed. Some other options you have available to you are maybe you have the ability to have employees work from home. So at this time, maybe you should have some of your staff re-enter the office while you keep others at home, and do that on a rotating schedule until you're back to your full capacity when we're at phase 3. And then you also want to make sure that you're providing any protective equipment that you're requiring employees to wear. So if you're requiring employees to wear facial cloth coverings in the workplace, you, the employer, must provide them. You also want to make sure that you're not discriminating against anyone who chooses to wear those facial coverings of their own accord. Some other recommendations in terms of maintaining social distancing is closing off your common areas. Maybe you have a kitchen, you don't want people congregating in there in order to continue that social distancing. Maybe you want to sit people every other desk instead of right next to them. Just some different things to consider. And the important things when it comes to implementing these safety policies is, of course, it's there to protect your employees, but it's also there to protect your business. If you're not following proper safety procedures during COVID-19, it could open you up to potential liabilities. And we've already seen with OSHA, there are pre-existing parameters with OSHA that state that if an employee does not feel safe in the workplace, they can deny coming to work and they are protected. They could also report you to OSHA for having unsafe work practices, of course. And OSHA did come out towards the beginning of the pandemic and say, look, these guidelines include safety around COVID-19. So you want to make sure you're doing everything you can as an employer to keep your employees safe so you don't have anyone making an unsafe workplace claim to OSHA, or it's possible that if someone does contract COVID-19 in your workplace and you did not take all necessary safety precautions, you could have a workers' comp claim on your hands, depending on the scenario. So keep that in mind when it comes to your safety policies. Now, when it comes to some of your staff might be members of this vulnerable population that we've all been hearing so much about in the news, people who have a pre-existing condition that may make contracting COVID more dangerous for them. Something to keep in mind during phase 1 and 2 is that the safer at home guidelines are in place. So the state of Oklahoma is encouraging employees and citizens who do have these pre-existing conditions to stay home. So you as an employer need to make sure you're following the reasonable accommodation procedures for any vulnerable employees who self-disclose to you. That doesn't mean that you should go around, saying, I think this employee's over 65, so I'm going to force him not to come to work. That's not what I'm saying. If someone comes to you and self-discloses that they're part of the vulnerable population, what you should do is enter into that interactive dialogue with them, ask them what type of accommodation they're looking for. And if they're looking for, an extended leave of absence until phase 3 is enacted, you are allowed to request for documentation. That is part of the reasonable accommodation process, and they can provide you with a doctor's note to substantiate the fact that they do need to quarantine as they are part of this vulnerable population. Now, phase 3 is projected to start June 1st. That is the plan. However, as we all know, we can't enter phase 3 until we've entered phase 2. So we really don't know if that will be the actual start date. So make sure you're staying up to date on when that comes into play. However, the plan for phase 3 is that summer camps will be opening and employers can resume unrestricted staffing of work sites. So very important for all of us on this call, as well as large public gatherings being permitted. So there'll be no restriction. So this brings us to recalling employees, right? We're opening our businesses up. We have our PPP loans, hopefully, and we want to make sure that we're back at operating, right? We need to be able to have enough employees in our business to operate. So how do you go about getting those employees back into your building? Let's talk about it. So when you're recalling employees, it's really working backwards from the way that you reduced your workforce, right? So the same parameters should be in play when you're looking at recalling employees in order to protect your business. What you want to ask yourself, you may not be recalling everyone at once. So you want to consider who you're going to recall first by asking yourself, what are my critical roles? How does this role affect my organization's strategy? And does the role require special skills and expertise? And really what that means for you is you might have someone in your business who's a real go-getter, who's so delightful to work with, and you love talking about, Westworld with them and recapping that by the water cooler, but that might not be the best person to call back to your business first. You want to make sure that you're doing it based off of your business needs rather than the individual's fit with your business, right? And that's because you want to support your business decision with documentation, and you want to be consistent in your criteria for recalling. And really the reason for this is to avoid any discrimination claims that could come your way stating, oh, well, they called back anyone under the age of 40 first and they discriminated against me, everyone who's over the age of 40. So you want to make sure you have that documentation in line. And having that documentation means being consistent in your criteria for recalling employees. And that could be, there's a number of different things that you could use to call back employees as your criteria. Just make sure that you're using the same one consistently, right? So that could be first out, first in, right? You could do it based off of this person's been out the longest, so I want to get them back in to get their paycheck going. You could do it based off of seniority. And you could also do it based off of merit. Just make sure you have previous documentation in place. So to support merit-based recalls, you could use past performance reviews or evaluations, or you could do it based off of progressive discipline, right? Oh, this person has a demerit on their record, so they're going to get called back last. Just make sure, again, consistency is key. And you want to make sure that when you're recalling employees that you offer their position back in writing. This is very important. The first reason is to protect yourself against liability claims, right? So you can't have someone come back a year later and say, hey, wait, they're filling my job and they never asked me to have it back, and that's because I'm, part of a protected class and they're discriminating against me. If you do it in writing, you have that evidence of, no, we contacted them on this date, we sent them a letter, or we sent them an email with a read receipt, and we know that they got it because we sent it certified mail, or we have that read receipt, and they never responded. So when you're writing those letters, it's important that you include in there a date they must respond by, right? You might want to give them a week, or, if you're sending it by mail, a little bit longer, but you say, we're calling you back, we need a response from you by this date. Some other things to consider, we're getting a lot of questions from the employers that we work with about, well, I do want to recall my staff. However, I don't necessarily have the work available for them because we're still a little slow. People are scared to go out still. So I don't have 40 hours worth of work for them, but I have 20. Can I call them back for 20? You absolutely can. So you can bring employees back based on the work you have available. The other thing you can do is if you need to bring them back at reduced wages because you can't afford to have them on your payroll at this time, maybe you didn't get the PPP loan, you can do that as well, bring everyone back full-time but at reduced wages. Just think about the implications of that for employee morale though. You're probably going to do better with employee morale calling everyone back at reduced hours where they can still collect unemployment potentially versus reduced wages. Which brings us to our next point about partial unemployment. if you are recalling employees at reduced hours, they would be eligible for a partial claim in the state of Oklahoma if they are working less than 4 days a week and earning a gross less than $539 per week. $539 per week is the maximum amount of unemployment you can receive in the state of Oklahoma. So you can't be earning more than that in order to receive unemployment. So the important thing to note about that as well is if an employee is eligible for unemployment, they're also automatically eligible to receive the additional $600 in federal unemployment assistance. And should they be ineligible for unemployment due to reduced hours, they will most likely be approved for that federal assistance as well. The federal assistance is intended for employees who would regularly be ineligible for unemployment. If they're affected by COVID-19 and ineligible, there we go, for unemployment, they may still be eligible for that federal funding, that $600 that we've all been hearing about so much in the news. Now, hopefully those of you who are already recalling your employees aren't getting a major headache like this young lady. So we're going to talk a little bit about what to do if your employees refuse to return to work. So if you've sent that letter out, right, or that email to your employee notifying them that you're recalling them back to work, and they've said they might contact you and say, look, I don't want to come back to work. You should really start off with a conversation with them of what are your specific concerns? Why don't you want to return to work? Because what we're hearing a lot of is employees are feeling uncomfortable returning to work due to concerns over COVID-19. They don't want to expose themselves potentially. So once you ask them about their specific concerns, if they're saying it's due to anxiety, you should just have an open dialogue with them about the steps that you're taking to keep employees safe and letting them know you have employee safety in mind. You know, you've put in cleaning procedures that are more intensive than they were previously. Maybe you've put a visitor policy in place that doesn't allow outside visitors in the building if you have an administrative office type environment. Let them know about the social distancing practices you've put in place. Maybe you're providing facial coverings or permitting employees to wear facial coverings because it doesn't impact their job duties negatively. So let them know about all those things you're doing and how you're thinking about your employees to make them feel more safe. Now, some of the things your employees may say to you are they may self-identify as a high-risk individual when it comes to COVID-19, which we've already spoken a little bit about that in terms of those entering that reasonable accommodation process. But the other thing you must do as an employer is you have an obligation to notify any employees of any leaves they may have available to them. So if they are an active employee, this wouldn't be the case if they were terminated. They wouldn't have any leaves available to them because they're no longer an employee, right? But if they're an active employee that you've recalled and they notify you that they're an at-risk individual, they may be eligible for the federal emergency paid sick leave. They may be eligible for FMLA, depending on the size of your business, and they may be eligible for an ADA leave of absence. Other thing they may be eligible for is the extension of FMLA, which is applicable to all employers if they have childcare issues. So keep those things in mind. Make sure that you notify the employee of their eligibility for those. Now, you may also have an employee who doesn't reply at all, or an employee who replies and says, you know what, I'm making more money on unemployment, I'm good. We're hearing that as well, unfortunately. You can notify them that you appreciate their response, but you will need to fill the position because you have the work available for them. So you'll need to fill their position. It will no longer be held for them, but they're welcome to apply for openings in the future. Make sure you keep it congenial. And then the second thing that you can notify them of is that their refusal to return to work may impact the status of their unemployment. And actually, the federal government is saying that it will, in fact, impact their unemployment claims. And it will also help you with your PPP loan as well. So that's why you want to make sure that you have that documentation in place. Once that employee refuses to return to work, you're going to want to send that letter to the Oklahoma Department of Labor by whatever means you usually respond to your unemployment claims. So whether that's fax or online or whatnot, you want to send them the letter and any corresponding evidence you have. So if you have an employee response, maybe they responded to an email or maybe they sent you a letter in response to your letter, you want to include that as well and provide them with as much documentation as you have possible to substantiate the fact that you did offer them their job back and they refused to work, because at that time their unemployment claim should be denied. All right, I'm going to kick it back over to Jose to talk about the new normal in the workplace.
All right, thank you, Jen. Let me just get my camera back up and running. All right, good morning again. So obviously a lot of great information that Jennifer just shared with you. I wanted to highlight something just really quick with regards to any paid leaves that you may be providing to your employees, whether it's under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave, the Emergency Family Medical Leave Extension Act. You want to make sure that you're tracking those leaves, because obviously for those of you that plan on applying for credits for providing those wages, you're going to need to have documentation to substantiate that the leave was an eligible leave, and how much leave the person actually took. This is something that you want to work with your payroll provider or your PEO if you have one, to make sure that everything's being coded properly. Their particular leave is being coded separately within your platform, your payroll platform, so that you can obtain those credits from the government as soon as possible. All right, so some of the things I want to talk about now with regards to workplace exposure and the CDC's guidance. So essential workers who have been exposed but remain asymptomatic obviously can still remain working if adhering to these guidelines, even now and going through these upcoming phases in Oklahoma. So obviously some of the things you want to consider is whether or not to pre-screen your employees as they enter the workplace. You can take their temperature and observe their symptoms, and these should be assessed prior to entering the facility. Keep in mind when administering any sort of test, you want to make sure to maintain as much privacy for the individual as possible. What we've seen many clients doing is setting up a small tent. Doesn't have to be anything expensive, just a small tent that allows the employee to have some privacy while the person administering the test, whatever the test is administering that test, and then making that determination right there and then of whether or not that employee can enter the facility. If you have multiple entry points, it may be best practice to have several tents set up so that you can get your employees into the workplace as soon as possible. Keep in mind from a compliance perspective, because this is going to slow down, obviously, the entry of employees into the workplace, you may be asking your employees or requiring them to arrive to work an hour early, potentially, whatever the time frame is, in order for them to get through the line to gauge their temperature, et cetera. If you're requiring an employee to report to work at a certain time that's earlier than their shift time because of a required process such as taking their temperature, it may likely be that time is compensable, and you may need to pay them for that time, especially for mainly for non-exempt, hourly employees. So that's something you may want to keep in mind. Now, just to expand a little bit on administering COVID-19 testing in the workplace, as we said earlier, things change regularly within the CDC guidelines and what the FDA is recommending, et cetera. And just a couple of days ago, just this week, the EEOC has updated their guidelines with regards to testing in the workplace. And they just wanted, some of the stuff is the same, but they wanted to remind employers that any mandatory medical test, whether it's gauging someone's temperature or something more specific to testing whether or not an employee actually is positive for COVID-19, any medical test has to be job related and consistent with business necessity. Now, when applied to the current COVID-19 pandemic, as employers, we want to make sure we take steps to determine if the employees entering the workplace will pose a direct threat to the health of others. Now, as businesses prepare to reopen during these unprecedented times, we want to make sure that we're cognizant of certain risks before just beginning to administer tests to employees. What we advise our clients and you know our clients, our employers, to be aware of the following risks, tips, and some recommended practices. So number one, in addition to privacy, as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that whatever tests you're using are accurate and reliable. You know, obviously, that's kind of difficult to do with the limited accessibility to testing nowadays, depending on if you're testing for COVID-19 directly, as opposed to just gauging someone's temperature. You know, employers should also follow the guidelines from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the CDC, and other public health authorities, and safely administer these particular tests. You want to keep up to date with any relevant updates and changes. As Jen alluded to, the Oklahoma State Chamber of Commerce's website is a great resource for any updates, and I highly recommend that you're consistently following up to make sure that as employers that we're keeping up to date with any requirements that might be placed upon us. You want to be mindful, obviously, that an employee could obviously initially test negative, but they could later acquire the virus. So what does that mean for us? Well, it means that we want to make sure we're still practicing social distancing in the workplace, that we're making sure that hand washing is of the utmost importance and followed in the workplace, and other infection control practices. You want them to be in place to avoid the spread of the virus that could affect, obviously, you being able to run and operate your business. And obviously, as Jen alluded to, requests from employees for some sort of reasonable accommodation, you want to handle them with care. As what we're expecting and what we're seeing is that a lot of employees, a lot of employees are asking for certain reasonable accommodations, especially if they feel that they fall within one of these particular groups that are high risk for exposure or high risk for complications due to COVID-19. Now, keep in mind that when we're discussing reasonable accommodations and these paid leaves, that's simply not wanting to come to work because I'm concerned or something to that effect. Although reasonable, that doesn't mean that that's a protected leave or protected request, or that you have to allow for some sort of reasonable accommodation for that person. That's something that you want to make sure with each instance, every request you get, make sure you discuss that with your HR team internally, or if you have a third-party provider that assists you with these types of assessments. I definitely would recommend, and it's best practice to assess each particular case. Make sure your managers and supervisors, because they're your eyes and ears on the front lines, make sure they're aware that if someone makes this kind of request, that they escalate that to HR or to whomever at your location is responsible for assessing whether or not an accommodation needs to be made. As Jen mentioned, you want to make sure you're regularly monitoring your employees, and they should also self-monitor for symptoms related to COVID-19, and leave work immediately if they become symptomatic. If you're required to wear a mask, as Jen said, you want to make sure they wear a mask. Employees should wear a mask at all times from 14 days from their last exposure, whether or not which they should be self-quarantining in the first place. Social distancing. We want to make sure that they're maintaining at least 6 feet apart as much as possible within the workplace. Something that's interesting, you may want to be think outside the box and how you can help maintain social distancing in the workplace, especially for certain environments where there might be a challenge. For example, if you have new employees that require one-on-one training, and it may require the supervisor, manager, whoever's doing the training to really be in short proximity to the person. Maybe they need to demonstrate things with their hands. We had a client that came up with an ingenious solution where they had a cart. The cart had a plexiglass wall, basically a barrier separating them from their employee, and thus being able to provide kind of that one-on-one observation or training with the employee while still maintaining social distancing and allowing for a safer means or method of training that employee. And obviously you want to continue disinfecting, cleaning, routinely cleaning and disinfecting all areas, and let your employees know. It's very important. I think one of the biggest one of the biggest aspects of throughout this entire crisis, that's one of the more important aspects, is communication. You really want to communicate with your staff what it is you're doing to maintain a safe work environment for them. That level of transparency, I think, is not just recommendable, but almost mandatory, I think, at this point. That's just my opinion, with regards to wanting to keep your business open, keep everything moving as close to normal as possible, is to have that kind of transparency with your staff as to what you're doing to keep them safe, so that they're more comfortable and more likely to come to work, and not necessarily keep away because they're concerned of exposure. All right. Now, a lot of clients have tried to come up with interesting ways to show employees that they appreciate the fact that they're coming to work during this pandemic. So some of the things you may want to do, you want to highlight to your employees some of the benefits you may have available to them, whether it's telemedicine, maybe the benefit program that you're on, maybe your insurance carrier does provide for telemedicine. I think most carriers now are definitely instituting some sort of telemedicine component if they weren't already before the pandemic. If you have an employee assistance program, definitely bring that up to your employees, advise them of the program. EAP is something that all of our clients have access to through Alcott's program, and it's so important because this is a very stressful time for a lot of people. Not only have they lost their jobs or have loved ones at home that have lost their jobs, they're stuck at home and having to self-quarantine or just have to comply with these safe at home orders. And it's a lot for a lot of people to take on right now. They turn on the TV and all they see is negative, negative, negative. Whether they're talking about the economy or killer hornets. I mean, it's kind of it's pretty stressful out there. And so the EAP will allow them an outlet to kind of deal with some of the stress that they're dealing with, not only at work, but maybe in their personal lives as well. And obviously highlight any other workplace benefits that you may have provided to them that we haven't listed here. Whether it's some clients assist with childcare, things of that nature. Whatever it is that you can do or have decided to do as a business to help your employees kind of achieve some sort of normalcy. Some clients have thought about providing hazard or appreciation pay in the form of some bonus or temporary increase to their employees that are working throughout this pandemic, have been considered essential, or have decided to return to work. That's commendable. Keep in mind, however, that whenever you increase an employee's pay, you run into the potential problem of that affecting what's called their regular rate of pay. Not to get too much into the legalese of it, but basically, when you have an employee that's eligible for overtime, so we're talking about non-exempt employees. If you have an employee that normally makes $15 an hour, and then they're given a bonus, and that bonus is non-discretionary. What I mean by that is they get it regardless. It's non-discretionary. They get it either way. So, for example, if I build 20 widgets a day, I get an extra $1 bonus per hour. If I work in the evenings, the night differential, I get an extra $1 per hour. Those are non-discretionary, which means that when you're calculating that person's overtime, if they trigger overtime, then those extra monies, those extra wages they're earning have to be calculated into their regular rate of pay, which means that their overtime rate is going to be higher. So one of the things you want to consider, it's best practice to make sure you communicate that any additional pay, whatever you're calling it, hazard pay, appreciation pay, whatever it is, if it's especially because of the pandemic, you're trying to show appreciation to your employees. You want to make sure that you communicate that this pay is discretionary and that it can be discontinued at any time. And you don't want to discriminate against those who need to quarantine or use federal leave. So what I mean by that is if you have someone that's working, goes out on leave, but they were already receiving the hazard pay or appreciation pay, it may be best practice with regards to any leave to include that hazard or appreciation pay as part of their leave wages if they have any. So it doesn't look like you're discouraging employees for taking a protected leave, because now if I take the leave, I'm going to lose some of this bonus money that I've been earning. So again, communication is key, and you want to make sure that the bonuses or hazard pay are discretionary. So what about benefits? That's another great question we get from our clients is, well, I'm bringing my employees back, but they really, I'm bringing them back and I want them to go back on benefits, but hopefully they can go back on benefits and just pick up where they left off. That's obviously, again, it's commendable, and hopefully that's something that you'd be able to accomplish, but it's something you're going to have to reach out to your carrier, your health insurance carrier, to make sure what are your options. Now, although many health insurance carriers are being realistic and understanding some of the challenges their employers are facing in the workplace based on the pandemic, you still want to make sure that the health insurance carrier is going to be flexible. So, for example, if they're returning to work, is there a minimum required hours per week that this employee has to be active and working in order to be eligible for health benefits, number one, or any other benefit? If they were on COBRA or some other state marketplace benefit or health insurance, you want to make sure that that COBRA or state marketplace health insurance or benefit that it's canceled upon return. What date will benefits restart? So, for example, if I bring back my employees today, May 8th, do they have benefits as of today? Do they have to wait till June 1st? Do they have to wait longer? These are questions you want to make sure that you ask of your insurance carrier before you start bringing back employees, so that you have that information readily available for your employees upon return. And also, if there's a waiting period for insurance for this benefit, is it waived for employees that are returning back? That's another question you want to ask of your health insurance carrier. If you typically have, for example, a 30-day waiting period, that an employee starts on the first date of the month following 30 days of employment. If that's your typical waiving period, as an example, are these employees subject to that same waiting period, or can they just resume benefits on the first of the month as soon as they return? So these are all things you want to keep in mind. Ask of your health insurance provider or other benefits or insurance provider prior to your employees returning to work. Now, just looking to the future, as I mentioned earlier, we've all been kind of thrust into this big social experiment. For example, everything from remote working to telemedicine. These are all things that as employers, maybe we never really thought we were going to implement. Social distancing in the workplace. These are things that were not, not something that we expected, but now it's here. And as many experts predict, and I agree, it's not going to go away anytime soon. So what does it mean for us as employers? So, for example, working from home. Many clients prior to the pandemic, the idea of remote work or telework has been a topic of discussion throughout our industry and throughout the workplace for many years now. Many clients, many employers have always felt that telework or remote work is not really something that will work for my industry. That won't work for my business. Well, in order to adapt to state mandated requirements to keep their businesses afloat, to keep running, a lot of employers have found a way to implement telework or remote work into their business model. And to the surprise of many, a lot of employers have said, hey, this actually does work for my industry. It does work for my business. In fact, we've had several clients that have instituted a remote work program and have found that they've actually had increased productivity from many of their employees. Some of the HR professionals and managers and business owners we speak to, they obviously realize a drastic decrease in some of the workplace distractions that can lead to decreased productivity, such as employee relations issues, arguments and things like that in the workplace. Some of those components that can lead to decreased productivity for employees, and are actually, a lot of these employers are now considering, upon return to quote unquote normalcy, about maintaining some sort of remote work aspect to their business model. Whether it means having certain positions that can work remotely permanently, we have from that extreme, all the way to, hey, maybe we can provide, a certain number of, 1 day per week or something like that, some sort of program that allows our employees to work from home. So a lot of clients are asking us to help them put together certain policies and remote work contracts, if you will, that would allow them to continue to do this moving forward, because employees are also going to have this expectation moving forward. They experienced this, they liked it, they want to keep doing it. And in order for you to retain that talent and maybe even attract new talent, there may be an expectation that teleworking or remote working is something that I want to be able to do. I'm looking for that as a benefit wherever it is that I work, if it's something that's reasonable under the circumstances. Obviously, cleanliness, oh, it's a lot more stuff there. Obviously, cleanliness and etiquette, as Jen mentioned, the same habits that we're developing now due to COVID-19, we want to maintain those habits moving forward, in for business continuity purpose, as well as for the protection of your employees and your staff. Social distancing in the workplace. What does that mean for us going forward? For example, if you have workstations, are your workstations currently at least 6 feet apart? Your conference rooms. If you have a 10 person conference room, but everyone's sitting elbow to elbow, is that something that's required? Do we need to do that moving forward? Can some of our meetings be done via Skype, via Zoom, via GoToWebinar, GoToMeeting, things of that nature? Utilizing some of these same resources we're using now, how can we use these resources to provide a safer environment for us moving forward? Some clients have even said they're thinking about reducing their office space, and because of remote work and having maybe half their staff working from home while half the staff is in the office, if that's something you can do, that allows them to require less of a footprint, less square footage, which can obviously have a dramatic effect on their rent or mortgage costs. Instead of having dedicated desks, some people, or workstations, or even offices, some clients have considered having workstations where people can come in, just plug and play wherever there's a spot available, which would allow them to, again, require less square footage to run their business. With regards to sick leave and attendance policies, keep in mind that although Oklahoma does not require employers to provide sick leave benefits, you need to take a look at your handbooks, take a look at any policies or memos you've written, or even your past practices to see if you created expectation of having some sort of sick leave benefit, because your handbook and your policies and even your own practices of how you've been responding to requests for sick leave in the past, that can create, in essence, a right to sick leave. And so that's something you want to make sure you look over your handbook, talk to your HR team or your HR provider, your HR professionals, to make sure that you're not putting yourself in a position where you're giving more benefits than you can afford to give at the time. All right. If you guys have any questions that you've posted, I guess one thing I'll add with regards to the policies is that many employers, including our clients, have already had policies with regards to employees being sick and working, encouraging employees to stay home if they're sick. But being that, unfortunately, some of the concern with COVID-19 is that this may not be an isolated incident, that this may be something that recurs on potentially even an annual basis. One of the things that our clients, that we're doing with our clients, is making sure that their sick leave policies in their handbooks also specifically talks about infectious diseases and in the workplace, and what to expect as an employer, or what will your employer do in a situation like that, and what's expected of employees with regards to infectious diseases, so that some of these things that we're implementing now due to COVID are going to kind of become policies moving forward to deal with obviously the desire to decrease exposure to infectious diseases in the workplace, so that it doesn't obviously infect your employees or your staff, but also doesn't affect the continuity of your business. All right. So, at this time, if there are any questions that you may have, I know we only have about 5 minutes left in the webinar. What we're also doing, as you can see on the bottom of the page, we have provided you with an email address that you can submit any questions that you may have or will have, and either Jen, myself, or one of our teammates will try to respond to your question within 24 to 48 hours as quickly as possible. If you haven't had the chance to ask a question here.
All right, so I do have a question here that I'm going to respond to. It is, what are best practices for mandating safety and employee privacy? Very good question in this current situation we're in. So when it comes to mandating safety in the workplace during a pandemic, it's best to communicate expectations very clearly to the employees. So just like any other policy you might have, right? You can't expect an employee to adhere to a policy that they don't know about. So when you want to release these temporary policies in writing to your employees, and when possible, you want to obtain employee confirmation of receipt. Now, if you don't want to have everyone hand around a pen and sign a piece of paper for exposure risk reasons, that's fine. You don't have to. You can send it via email and obtain a receipt confirmation for your employees, or require electronic signatures. And as with all policies that you have, you want to make sure that you're holding your employees accountable, because if you're not holding them accountable for adhering to policies, you might as well not have them, right? It's like telling a kid they can't have ice cream on school nights, and then they just keep going into the freezer and eating it anyway, and you don't say anything. They're going to keep doing it. So you want to make sure that when if your employees violate any temporary safety policies that you put in place or permanent, they should be treated in a manner consistent with past company practices to policy violations. The second part of this question is about employee privacy. I would expect whoever's asking this is currently collecting employee temperature information, which is something you should be doing if you do have a potential exposure in your workplace. During a pandemic, the expectation of employee privacy is reduced, which is why you can do things like take employee temperatures. However, you should continue to maintain employee privacy in order to remain HIPAA compliant, especially when it comes to health information for HIPAA compliance. So any health-related information that you collect, like doctor's notes, requests for the emergency paid sick leave, health questionnaires, or temperature histories, should be maintained in a locked file cabinet that has restricted access to it. So, if everyone has a key, it's not really a locked file cabinet, right? You want to make sure maybe it's your HR department or whomever oversees those types of documents has access to them and no one else. And as under normal conditions, you don't want any health information to be kept in employee or personnel folders. This information should be kept separately from your employee folders. And you should maintain a separate filing system for all health-related data. I do have another question here, and I think we might have time for one more after that, but this might be the last one. So this person is asking, they said, is there any word coming on additional benefits for employees that are at work? We have essential team members working at normal wages and non-essential staff at home making more than their normal wage with the $600 additional from the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program. So this is a question that we have been getting from our employers. I know that there was conversations and for this upcoming round of COVID relief bill, that there would be something comparable to like a heroes fund where it provided additional compensation for employees who were considered essential employees. However, I know that this round for the bill proposal has been a lot more contentious than previous rounds. And so I can't say that we'll necessarily see that come through in the final bill, unfortunately. I believe there's going to be a final proposal. The language for the final proposal will be available next week. So at that point, we'll know more information on what could potentially be coming down the pipeline for additional COVID relief.
Yeah, and keep in mind, for any of your employees that are currently out collecting unemployment and obviously excited that they're receiving this extra $600, the $600 benefit is scheduled, unless something changes, is scheduled to expire at the end of July, on July 31st of 2020. So that's something that again, not to necessarily, it doesn't necessarily alleviate the concerns of the employer or your employees that are actually coming to work, but it is going to be a short-lived benefit. And that's why it may be important to indicate that or to remind employees of that in your communications with them if you're having troubles in rehiring and restaffing your business. Because obviously, if you refill their position because they stay out and want to collect unemployment, they don't, it's going to be less likely they're going to be able to return to work, at least with you. And so maybe by advising your employees, or excuse me, advising the individuals you want to rehire, I should say, of number one, how the benefit is only until July 31st, and secondly, the refusal to return to work, given all the safety measures you're taking to create a comfortable and safe environment for them, they can risk losing their benefits even now, not just on July 31st. So it's something to keep in mind as well.
All right, well, that is all the time that we have today. Thank you so much for everyone who attended. I know we didn't get to everyone's question, but if you do have additional questions that come up, just as Jose said, please feel free to email that okstatechamber@alcotthr.com, and someone from our team will get back to you with a response as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a great weekend.